No.
Yeah.
Everything
Could
that
be a
they-
decade.
I think everything.
Thank you.
Everything
Oh, wait,
is
let me
constant.
put it-
Oh, I'm
so
sorry.
we get
Sorry.
it easy,
You think, oh, man.
Yeah, do you?
Do you want that?
Oh, yeah, you will help me a lot.
Thank you. Well, we get some help there. Thank you again for the invitation. We're very happy to join not only this symposium, but the community. The Latinx community, the university. It's been like some month that we have talked about it, and we're glad that it's like our very first time, right? Like to people who are studying, understanding this community in a wider form. So thank you, Ken, Lucinda, and Javier. I don't know if Javier is here. Thank you for the organization. And we're Rodolfo Hernández.
Jen Henderson.
And we're going to do sort of a conversation. So apologize if it's too performative or too experimental, but this is an experiment. Okay. So, hola, Jen. Thanks for being my host, mentor, colleague, maestra y amiga over the last 5 months at Texas Tech. Among all those labels, the one I like the most is amiga. I believe that by now you've already noticed that Colombians make you a friend if you smile at them. Gracias. Let me disclose something to you right now. I might be the best of the world, but I still need something from you. Let me explain. I'm a postdoctoral researcher in a project Jen Henderson and Eric Nielsen from Texas A&M co-lead about the relation between compound weather hazards like tornadoes and flash floods and COVID-19 vulnerability during hurricanes. Sounds interesting, right? Well, sure it does. This study is part of a broader national oceanic and atmospheric administration initiative that bridges social science with crucial forecast and meteorological agendas. In short, our research outcomes will become knowledge input for critical partners of the meteorological service. I hate to say meteorological, so sometimes I would say meteorological. But I invited you to join a different conversation. I still need something different from you and us to co-present on the easy topic of how to change the world by setting up a qualitative research lab. In Spanish, de nada, amiga. The Risk Equity in Disaster Red Lab is a space you conceived before I came to Tech, but it has become a common ground for us to think about academia and the place of social sciences. Trying to capture this in 20 minutes and capture all the conversation about designing and opening Red Lab at Texas Tech, I asked you to join this symposium. So, because as we will disclosure, what began as simply launching a lab became the crossroads of geographies and identities, or as an experiment, just like the title of this presentation suggests. As a lawyer representative of postdoc researchers, I humbly stop talking now and ask you a question to begin this conversation. What did provoke you setting up the idea of a lab? Not any lab, but a qualitative research lab.
And I'm going to go off script here and be more spontaneous with my responses. But I come from a background of creative writing, primarily humanities and qualitative research. So when I was thinking about lab spaces, it was primarily through the lens of critique originally. The tradition of the lab in the physical science space, dominated by largely, white men who are studying ephemeral kinds of materials and creating knowledge and producing knowledge, and a power structure at the university, and that if you had a lab as one of the kind of pyramid builders, the way it was explained to me in grad school is that you sort of create a lab and then you build your pyramid underneath you of all the little minions who do work for you, and then you take credit for this, and this is the model of the lab that of course we disassembled and critiqued as part of my studies. But then when I became an assistant professor, I worked in a research lab before moving here, so I'm familiar with lab spaces. I've moved in lab spaces most of my career. But when I moved to Texas Tech, to the geosciences department as a qualitative researcher and one of only 2 human geographers, the question was, what do you need for your lab? And I found myself in the space of thinking about how to create a lab that was different from the labs at which I had, understood them to be before. How do I take what I've learned as critique and how do I build that into the practice of lab spaces? What does that look like to be a qualitative lab? Who are the instruments, the human instruments rather than the technological instruments that we can engage with and build a lab around? And so bringing in Rodolfo as a postdoc was not only an essential piece of the grant, but my very good luck to have found somebody so thoughtful who is interested in this lab space, whose expertise and background complement my own. And I think then we have this really interesting opportunity to think about and think with the idea of a lab, even as a metaphor. Is that the metaphor we want? Do we want to appropriate that? How might we change it? To think about risk and equity and disasters, which is the space in which I work.
So I feel social scientists are today in a unique position in society, but also at the edge of uncertain times we fear and quite don't understand well. These encounters are probably the main obstacle to overcome, and they are at the order of the day. Let me explain this with a caveat. I again might turn very personal, postdoctoral bias syndrome. My mentors and previous generations of post-70s Latin American social scientists pride themselves of having integrated their expertise into broader societal transformations of the time. Call them utopias or revolutions. There was a shared ground that almost organically connected to every changing dimension of existence, say the subjective, individual, partisan, the social, cultural, economical realms. When I was in anthropology undergrad in the 2000s, academia was nothing more different from the post-70s generation. Half of my classmates were doing internships with companies that needed a qualitative understanding of markets and their clients. Social marketing and alternative advertisement wanted us. I was nostalgic though. I had my version of Pensadores de la Izquierda Latinoamericana, because as you might have guessed, they were all affiliated with leftist movements, right? By engaging in issues with forcibly displaced people, agonizing unions, and human rights in Colombia. To keep my research agenda alive, I think just an activist, I found a safe place in adopting the very nod of the sociological practice in Colombia, the Participatory Research Action, IAP, how we call it in Spanish after Investigación Acción Participativa. This theoretical and methodological perspective was incubated in peasant struggles of the 70s and transformed the privileged epistemological and ontological positions of the scientific community. Orlando Falsborda, the Colombian sociologist and one of the founders of IAP, at least in our country, described it beautifully in the following way. Do not monopolize your knowledge, nor impose arrogantly your techniques, but respect and combine your skills with the knowledge of the research or grassroots communities. Take them as full partners and co-researchers. Do not trust versions of history and science which responds to dominant interests, but be receptive to counter narratives and try to recapture them. Do not depend solely on your culture to interpret facts, but recover local values, traits, beliefs, and arts for action by and with the research organization. Do not impose your own ponderous scientific style for communicating results, but diffuse and share what you have learned together with the people in a manner that is wholly understandable and even literary and pleasant. For science should not be necessarily a mystery nor a monopoly of experts and intellectuals. Again, I would like to stress that we social scientists are in an exciting position today, beyond what anthropologists like my friends keep doing in corporations. Coincidences are evil traps, but sometimes they serve noble purposes. 30 years ago, Falsborda talked about the convergence of North-South, which I suppose was a declaration of intellectual fraternity, beyond the fractures of colonial and militaristic legacies of the developed world. It was also a prompt for new generations of Latin American social scientists to set the tone of new dialogues with communities of professionals outside our own political and social worlds. In the last decade, there has been an intensive diaspora of scientists from the global south to the centers of power, and a novel two-way interaction between home and the outside. We live, but not forever. We go back. Then a fascinating question of our identity and the new possibilities of collaboration emerged naturally. These encounters are entrenched in the spirit of time. However, can we propose something to share as social scientists beyond our methods and theories? That's a question for you, Jen. And if from your space of practice as a social science expert, you have noticed that kind of disencounters and how can we go beyond that?
Yeah, the social science encounters.
Yeah, disencounters.
Yeah. I think one of the ways that I think about going beyond the traditional spaces is I spend a lot of time with experts in expert communities. I study, as they say, study up within the National Weather Service. I spend a lot of time trying to bring social science into a community that is largely dominated by physical and operational meteorologists and thinking about that space. And so I'm trying always to think about moving beyond, just the methods and the technologies into other kinds of principles that underlie how I think about social science and what we bring to the world. Some of that is through education and training. Some of that is through methods and through publications. But the primary way that I see myself as an embedded social scientist is through practices of ethical kind of relationships with others, building communities within these physical science spaces over time. And what that kind of affords social scientists then in terms of accessing resources, but also learning from other people who are, at least in my case, similarly aligned in thinking about how to build warning systems or infrastructural systems that can prevent death and help mitigate harm from different kinds of hazards. So for me, it moves beyond that kind of original social science space. I feel like at times that's the label that the meteorologists gave me in order to make me intelligible. I was a humanist coming into their space, that they said, oh, you study humans, you're a social scientist. So that's the label I've taken on in that space. And so I think it's just really for me building those relationships and then thinking about how in a laboratory space, which is, a physical space here at the university, but we've conceptualized it much broader than just a physical space, to be out in the communities, to be up in the communities that I work with, up in the communities that Rodolfo works with, kind of expanding on kind of the ways that we see ourselves as social scientists in relation to others, and what those relationships will look like. So I think at the center of all this for me is kind of an ethical practice.
So if a qualitative lab goes beyond its physical space, could we say that the values and practices lab practitioners carry out what make it real somehow? Now I'm thinking about the field we both are affiliated, Science and Technology Studies, STS. For the audience new to STS, it focuses on how science and technology interweave modern states, institutions, and society. The STS research enterprise can be summarized as how science and technology constantly shape and reshape modernity. Its evolution has captured science and technology as a historical and socially constructed phenomenon, expressing the continuum between the abstract world of ideas, the dynamics of the actions of individuals and groups, and the materiality of the representation. Science and technology are not only university labs, scientists, data, and models, to mention some of its current popular metaphors, but also power relations, politics, experts, and citizens. There is a tradition in STS known as lab studies, which consists in sending ethnographers to labs who re-explain in qualitative words what's at stake when talking about methods, knowledge, and science. The metaphors resulting from lab studies are illuminated, like the famous one from French philosopher STS figure Bruno Latour describing the power of labs. Quote, give me a lab and I will raise the world. STS provides us with that framework, but we think in different metaphors, right? We are instead thinking about the experiment of a qualitative lab, from the challenges of the aesthetical, the civic, and the political instances of social science and scientific knowledge. And among other branches of STS, capturing this reflection, we might have to talk about feminist technoscience, civic engagement of technosciences, and social appropriation of science. Remember my syndrome, so I will start with my own experience. Before we briefly explain those, I'd like to touch base on social appropriation of science, a framework that was adopted in Colombia back in the 90s, echoing Anglo-Saxon STS scholars' ideas on the popularization of science and technology and the state-level promotion of it through popular science books, festivals, and venues. It was also a local version of a Latin American education movement that began in the 70s, pushing back against science literacy formulas widely adopted in the global south and promoted by multilateral organizations like UNESCO. Today, social appropriation has different versions of it. There is a public policy, regional programs, evaluation indicators for universities, public grants, and practitioners from academia and, most important, society. Among the present different versions that I have talked, I'd like to emphasize one common principle: mediation. Across the universe of this social appropriation of science world, I feel the action of mediating is a pendulum between the language and practice of scientific knowledge and understanding its adoption by communities in their context. It's iterated because communities are more than ever aware of alternative knowledge or new evidence, and also the nature of scientific knowledge, as we all know, it's to be ceaselessly reassessed. We also have a space to expand on feminist technoscience approach. And I'd like to hear a little bit more what you. Oh yeah, I even forgot that social appropriation of science. Sorry.
Yeah, so you can read here, but I think for me, the importance of feminist technoscience is acknowledging that in a lot of ways the lab is performative and that it takes on a kind of practice that is different from laboratories that have at its center production of knowledge and the practices of production of machinery and mechanisms of production, that it becomes fast-paced and measured in quantitative kind of outputs and serves only a few people in order to further their careers, these sorts of ideas of laboratory work. And so feminist technoscience, I think, asks us to think about the metaphor of the lab. In fact, I think about this lab, it makes me uncomfortable to call it a lab at times, but I know I'm also within an institution in which you have an opportunity to use the lab space to further different causes than what the university might have in mind. And so in that way, it can be somewhat subversive. I think of a colleague of mine, Max Legrand, who does some work with a technology she calls baby legs. And it is actually a plastic collector made from the tights of little kids that she drags alongside the trawlers and has measured and calibrated against the larger trawlers that measure plastic pollution. And she's been able to capture much smaller plastics. But to avoid the institutional kind of surveillance that would appropriate her technology and demand patents, she makes it very feminized. It's pink, it's called baby legs, it's DIY science for communities. And so it allows her to use the laboratory as a space to be counter to the narratives of production and appropriation of science by the practitioners of the science for the good of the university and the institution. So I think about that as one opportunity to build a kind of space that's different and that draws on a whole host. You can't really see this slide here. We're happy to send out these different examples, but there are so many different labs that are challenging the model of the lab, not even using the metaphor of the lab, co-ops, collaboratories. You've probably heard many of these names. But that's one of the central, I think, values that I have at the center is how to slow down and think differently about the laboratory space in order to appropriate some of the resources and the support of the university, but to change the practices and the ways of being within the lab itself.
We come to a promising space of civic engagement of technoscience. which builds on some of the traditional agendas of citizen science and the popularization of science. However, in doing so, it attempts to overcome frequent critiques associated with them, such as standing on a deficit model to promote the participation of lay people in science or mischaracterizing the crisis of the legitimacy of science. In that regard, civic engagement relates to the conviction of citizen groups that science and technology should support urgent transformations in society, such as environmental health and justice research. It adds experimental and tactical approaches to establishing spaces like living labs, and maker spaces, and building a liaison between grassroots community, experts, and lay people. Fundamentally, it changes the tone of the conversation with traditional scientific institutions, such as universities, demanding collaboration that need active involvement from experts and communities, and taking advantage of DIY and low-cost technologies, open science knowledge, and open source platforms. This is the final point of the conversation, and it's almost a starting one for us. What are the principles of this new experiment called Red Lab? For what I have said and what I have heard from you, I would risk that one of the principles is working nonstop, right? And we might have at least one consensus. We're building the principles as the experiment is developed. And by now, we do have a basic one. I call it, and I know you might have another name, but it's care about caring for humans involved in the lab. Sounds obvious, isn't it? But sometimes the human dimension is not so obvious here. So I'd like to listen more what you think about caring in a space like a lab.
Yeah. I think the values of the lab are counter to the normative kinds of lab values in that, like you said, caring about people, and primarily situating the people who participate in the lab, and not just the students and the faculty, but the community, those people who are technology experts, or IT experts, whoever is in the laboratory space, managing the ethic of care that I think recognizes and demands that we have a responsibility to the relationships that we develop with individuals, and that those relationships then shape how we behave and how we practice. And so a lot of the things that were in an earlier slide I had listed on my board at home, it's like, how could I get my sister-in-law who teaches yoga to do yoga practice with my lab members? How could I get this other person who podcasts about self-care to think about self-care? How can we make sure we institute bringing food and making sure that it's a space of kind of community each time, that we pay people for their labor in our lab, that it's not just given that we will give credit or authorship, but other tangible forms of payment, that people we work with, that we pay. So we recognize the labor that's involved. I think there are many mechanisms for this, but one that I'll also steal from my colleague LeBron. Her lab is, if you're ill or brokenhearted, go home. I mean, there's a sense that you don't sacrifice yourself, you don't give over all of you to a laboratory space because you're trying to meet some metrics or outcomes or productivity, but that the labor and the health of the individual in the lab and the people that we serve with is equally as important as the outcomes. In fact, they are outcomes, producing healthy relationships, healthy people as a part of our practice. So for me, I think it's multiple types of care. And I probably have just a limited amount of what I imagine as care. I think I want to extend that to the participants, what care looks like to them, to the colleagues that we have in the lab, what that looks like to them. It's in my own practice with research, the people that I work with who are experts in the community, while they're participants, they're also my very good colleagues. I've been embedded in this community for 10 years. And we started referring to each other as analytic partners, because the words participant and researcher create this divide. And it also invites them to this community-based practitioner framework, which engages both of us in learning from one another. So these are some of the instances of care.
And finally, I don't know if you all noticed that one key line of this conversation is the statement about intercultural encounters of science, community, and society. Well, there are no encounters if we overlook the geographies and histories we carry on our work and bodies. We And certainly there will be cumulative disencounters if we avoid facing these problems in the daily life of the lab and the research questions we pursue. It has been clear that setting a qualitative lab that studies social environmental complex issues takes a reflective approach or reflexivity about our position as researchers, the academic space, and our cultural and professional identities. Responding to this complexity, we propose at least a second principle, which might be situatedness in research as to keep building our lab. It summarizes the complex network of background beliefs and assumptions, knowledge frameworks, and methodological instruments that support our ideas and articulate them with the work we do as researchers and the context we apply them. A relation that we hope echoes the negotiation of epistemological frameworks and methods with communities and allows us to become real mediators of science and society. Thank you. We have time for.
What I'm going to suggest is that Howard goes and sets up and we do like a quick question.
Yeah.
In the meantime, I'll be
Sure.
doing that. So aprovechar el tiempo, right? Are there any questions for Jen and Rodolfo while we're making the transition there? I have a quick one. It may require a long answer, but try to give a short one. I mean, what kind of forms of resistance have you encountered in sort of presenting this? Because it's a critique of the way labs traditionally operate or organized. I was reflecting on, my father's lab, and he's a physicist, and actually incorporated a lot of what you were talking about back in the 60s and 70s, which is kind of interesting in the physics space. But what kind of, resistance have you got? How do you respond to that resistance?
I know we don't face too much in our own STS space, science technology study, because we're all part of that same thought that see these spaces as part of what we said, power relations and in a wider context. But I feel there is a pushback for some other scientists, right? Like they won't see it in that way.
Yeah, I think for me, there's two ways of framing the lab. There's the way that I talk about the lab. It's audience based. I talk about this lab in these spaces where I feel like it's safe to critique and reveal that we are a feminist techno-science civic laboratory that is doing a certain kind of counter narrative. But when I'm talking to funders or I'm talking to department chairs or resource communities, I don't frame it this way. We are risk, equity, and disasters. We study different kinds of disasters. We look at risk. We are about equity in our lab. So we have our principles out there, but we don't necessarily talk about, at least I don't necessarily talk about the subversive nature of what our lab is trying to do as explicitly to certain audiences. So I think that's sort of the protective nature of the lab. I mean, it's not that can't be known and revealed by, different groups to other groups, but I certainly frame it according to the audience that I'm talking to. And so it's one way that I try to mitigate that resistance.
I hadn't even thought of that element of the pressure under your grants, external funding, how that's driving so much of the growth and sort of ascendance, if you will, with the university, and how this could really be seen as undermining it, although from a sort of humanistic communication perspective, we're like rah, let's bring private into the lab, and it's great, but it might not be seen that way by those who are the boxes are doing our evaluation.
Yeah, I mean, we still bring in money and we still produce publications. And so from the exterior, we look like a fully functioning lab, but it's in our way of talking internally and with people we communicate and collaborate with that the values are differently discussed. But I don't know if we are an experiment, we are new. This is my first year as an assistant professor. We'll see.
And I think we brought the topic of communication of science, thinking also on the tactics that, these kind of tactics that we have to sort of adapt to our own exercise. And I won't go that far as to talk to NSF or some big institution inside department that are like ours, that they are very multidisciplinary. Sometimes talking with all that vocabulary about politics, power, that people will just not pay so much attention. Yeah.
The geologists don't really care about it. Like bring in grants and publish papers. That's their metric. And they're lovely people, but they just don't care about the power dynamics of the people. So for some of it, isn't unintelligible for them. But I'm sure we'll encounter resistance.
Thank you very much. I think we should
Thank you.
transition to Howard.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me. Make sure that I'm centered with the camera. Right. You're going to see a little bit of a discrepancy between what I'm going to discuss and what was originally posted in the abstract of my presentation. When I initially conceptualized this project, I selected about 200 articles that were focused on a given area. Afterward, I conducted a more thorough research or search and found more resources. So what you're going to see now is an expansion of what you see on that, what you saw in that description. So my topic, Hispanic and Latinos in veterinary and related disciplines quality of output. Several years ago, I was working on a different project. Actually, it was on a marketing communication project, and I was looking at the literature in word of mouth. And I pulled out about 900 articles, and I was curious about whether those articles reflected the mindset, the culture, the different aspects of Hispanic and Latinos in word of mouth. Given that Hispanics, word of mouth is part of their culture, right? We talk, we gossip, we pass information to each other, right? So word of mouth is part of our cultures, part of many cultures, but it's an essential part of Hispanic and Latinos. So out of the 900 articles, I look at just those that cited or listed Hispanics or Latinos and came down to about 45 articles. So 45 out of 900, okay. Let's look in depth into those articles. And I found out that many of those articles only listed Hispanic or Latino in the demographic table from the census when they were explaining the demographic of a particular population. So out of all those articles, many of them only listed Latino in that table from the census. The article wasn't about Hispanics or Latinos or their perspectives. Others only listed like Hispanic or Latinos as part of the title that was in the bibliography. So it wasn't even part of the body of the investigation. Eventually, out of the 900 articles, one article discussed the perspective of Hispanics and Latinos in word of mouth out of all that literature. Now, that was an eye-opener for me. Now, I'm an information, I may call it myself information scientist. My PhD is on information-seeking behaviors. And then I did a master's in marketing and professional communication, so I expanded into that. Prior to that, I did a master's in library sciences. So right now I'm the librarian at the Texas Tech Veterinary School, but my research is in communication, information-seeking behavior, right? So I'm learning about veterinary sciences. I'm looking into the research. So I decided, let's import what I learned from previous master degrees, research and whatnot. I started exploring more into the veterinary science literature, and that's how I came up with this. Now I want to see what are, if the literature in veterinary science takes into consideration or integrates or aggregates the perspectives of Hispanics and Latinos, not only in the United States, but around the world. That's how I came up with this. Context and issue. You know that medical literature has been around for centuries, literally, right? And it's an extensive body of knowledge in medicine, general medicine. There's a wealth of knowledge, a wealth of research, a wealth of insights and practices. But one of the big criticisms over the last 2 decades or so is that it's too much Western centered, right? So It doesn't take into consideration other cultures or the perspective or knowledge or skills from other parts of the world or other cultures. So part of what is missing in general is that multicultural knowledge, the research insight, the practices. Indigenous, local, and regional knowledge is critical, not only for those areas, but if you're talking about medicine, you want to integrate different perspectives. Something that our colleagues were expressing just a few minutes ago is that you don't monopolize research, right? Well, that has been the issue for centuries in literature. So I'm trying to explore how the veterinary literature integrates or not, whether it integrates or not other perspectives. Basically, I'm looking for inclusion and representation. As Hispanic Latino, I'm very much aware about the invisibility of us in different aspects of the profession and in the culture. So I want to explore, this is an exploratory study, and this is actually the starting of an exploratory study to find out more about that. The aim of the study, this is a study in progress. Part number one, this is an exploratory overview. I'm looking for the inclusion of Hispanics and Latino groups in veterinary and allied disciplines. And for that, I went into Scopus, which is a science citation database. And I selected all the articles on a particular area. I'm going to explain a little bit more about that, but articles since the year 2000 all the way to now. I want to see if there's any pattern, any trends, anything in that period of time. Part number two is going to come up after the results of part number one, and that is an in-depth content and thematic analysis. And I'm going to look at Hispanic Latino focused research, insight, issues, and topics. So the part where I'm going to find out whether our perspectives are integrated, aggregated, or not is going to come out of the second study. Let me explain something. I'm not a veterinary. I'm not a veterinarian. I'm a librarian turned communications turned into many hats, so to speak, right? So veterinary science, contrary to popular belief, is not just about animals. There are a lot, I believe me, as a new librarian in that area, there's a lot beyond just animals. It's also taken into consideration the care of animals, raising of animals, protection, welfare, behavior of animals, not only of animals, but then also how people relate to animals to some extent. Also the industry, food production, and other aspects as well. So the veterinary scholarly literature is also relatively extensive, but it's very multidisciplinary, multidisciplinary. Not only in the perspectives of what they cover, but the research may not be just veterinary centered. It could be a study about immunology. It could be about public health. It could be an epidemic study. So there are many disciplines that are drawn to veterinary science or veterinary science draw from. So it becomes very interdisciplinary. The problem with that, and not technical problem, but an issue with that is that when you're looking at publications about veterinary medicine, if you just only look at veterinary databases, you're going to miss a lot that may be important or related. So veterinary literature, not only pure veterinary medicine, but here are some of the related disciplines that may include publications that are actually about veterinary research. Veterinarians and researchers may choose to publish their research in any journal in any of those areas, not just veterinary science. So as a librarian and as a researcher, when I'm looking for articles, I have to be aware, I have to be conscious that I have to look at different places just to make sure that I'm capturing every aspect of that. One of the alternatives for me was to focus on this citation database because they cover a lot of those disciplines. And with over 34,000 journals in all these areas, there's a very good chance that the articles I'm looking for are mostly there. I'm not going to say exclusively there, but there's a good chance they're going to be there. So to conduct this, I initially searched on Scopus on information about veterinary and agricultural articles. And I'm including agricultural because the agricultural databases include biological and animal sciences, separate from veterinary sciences in Scopus. I was only looking at articles in English because I'm going to run a content analysis. And when you do content analysis, it's really not recommended that you mix different languages, right? And I'm looking at the years that I mentioned, and the limiters is that I'm looking at veterinary and agricultural sciences in the title abstract keywords. And for that, I was looking veteran for veterinary and the wildcard to expand everything that has to do with veterinary, veterinarian, and so on. And agriculture, agriculture, things like that. Scopus, the result was over 336,000. That's in general, right? That's basically the corpus from Scopus on that particular area. So that's my starting point. That was my starting point. And I wanted to focus on articles and scholarly articles and conference proceedings that are related to Hispanic and Latinos. And again, I used the wildcard to expand. So it could be Hispanic, Hispano, Hispana, Hispanos, Hispanas of plurals, gender, different variations. Same thing with Latin. And I added also demonyms. So I was looking at particular ethnographic groups for all Latin American countries. So Colombia, Nicaragua, Venezuela, and I added also all the wildcards to make sure that I'm capturing every possibility. When I limited those 336,000 articles using those limiters, I ended up with almost 10,000 articles with each. It may seem like a lot, but that's really manageable for software I'm using. So that was my starting point, and from there, it was just a breeze to download all those 10,000 citations. Many people will say, that's crazy, 10,000 citations. It took 16 seconds to basically transport that into the software that I needed. So I used Scopus to the Texas Tech Library, use Citavi, which is similar to EndNote, to download those citations, and from Citavi, I transported it to my research software, Provalis and osstab. So the first part to do a content analysis or any kind of analysis in this kind of body of work, you have to create a categorical dictionary. What are the terms that you're going to use to search within that body of knowledge? To do that, I look at the 9,500 articles, and through the software, I run a keyword extraction. It took about 2 minutes to analyze every text in the title, abstract, and keywords of those 10,000 articles. And if you look at that little square on top, the result is over 2 million keywords. That's where the fun begins. What I did was to export that into Excel, organize it in alphabetical order, and from that, I was able to pull out all the keywords that are related to demonyms or are related to Hispanic or Latinos. I'm going to show you in a minute. The categories, I use those keywords that were extracted from the text to create the categories. Let me see if there's yeah, perfect. The words that you see within each category and each folder is actually the category that I created. These words came actually from the text. You're going to see that there are some terms that may be missing, and that's because I only use information that emerged directly from the text. So you see Hispanic, Hispanica, Hispanics, and Hispanos. That myself is one category which I named Hispanic and Latinos. Those were my first two categories, Hispanic and Latino. After that, I went to the demonyms, which are in good Spanish, gentilicios, for all the countries that appear in the text. There are some countries that may be missing, and that's again because they were not listed in the text. Examples here for Guatemalan, Guatemalans in plural, Guatemalteco, and Guatemalteque. That came from the literature, so I imported that and created a general category. Mexicans, as a matter of fact, Mexican is the only demonym that included Mexican American. None of the other countries included that, and that again came from the text. So we have two groups of categories there, Hispanic Latinos, demonyms. And the third one, other interest groups that came out from the same body of the literature, including migrants, immigrants, Amazonians, so some regional areas, Caribbean, Andean, Amerindian, Islander, Mesoamerican, and so on, other special groups. All of that from the literature. And lastly, a few ones that you see down here are countries from the Americas that do not speak Spanish. So we have Belize, Brazil, and Haiti. And because they were listed in the literature, I didn't want to skip over them. Word frequency analysis. Once I created my category, I went back to the 9,500 articles and used the categories to extract and identify which particular articles included keywords that were related to my search term. And this is what came out. And again, another 2 minutes to analyze 10,000. Don't you know that? Frequency of words. You get to see on the top corner there where I highlighted frequency. These are the categories with the most words in the 10,000 articles. So the first one, words that are related to Latino, Latinx, Latina, Latinos, etc. Second, Brazil, which is not one of my initial categories, came up as a second level. Mexicans, Argentinian, migrants, and so on. And this software, I love it. It automatically creates for you a word map. Basic, you can select the frequencies, percentages, etc. The number of cases, one of the columns over here, this is actually the number of articles that include keywords that are listed in this category here. So if I look again at Latino, keywords related to Latinos are included in 839 articles out of the 10,000. So that was my first part, was to do a word frequency evaluating the 10,000 articles. That was the result. Then the fun starts, because now I can look at that body of search and cross-analyze it with different variables. My first cross-tab was to look at the publication of those articles and included my keywords by the year they were published. I wanted to see if there are any trends. Are they publishing more, less, how much, how little, or not? And yes, that's a table, but I can convert that table into something that can communicate to me and the public what are the strengths and weaknesses, how much, how little, any trend going up or going down. We just transporting it to Excel and just play with some of the settings, I created a heat map. This by itself is one of the outputs of this research. I get to see what keywords are published the most, what year, if there's any trend going up, any trend going down, or whatnot. And interestingly, and I'm not gonna get political here, but I found something interesting here. Keywords related to migrants were on an upward trend until the year 2017, when everybody was scared to talk about migrants and immigration, right? And then out of 22, that was 23, 22 the most, and then it went down to 7. And then it catch up again and started all over again. That may be an explanation, but we have to look into that further. But look at here, Mexican, you get to see the upward trend up to the last 3 years when we're publishing the most. And this is related to veterinary science. So there is a trend on on that keyword. The other big one, Latinx, Latino, Latinx, which is the biggest hit. Which countries or which peoples are represented the most, the least? What years are there in trends? This by itself is a good output for this research. Of course, the software allows you to play with data, so you have different options. This is a bubble chart that may give you similar information. My second cross-tab analysis was to look at my keyword categories and to analyze how many journals are publishing on these Latino categories. Now, total number of journals that publish these articles, the number is over 1,600. So if I were to continue this table to the real length, we need 63 screens together. So it's going to go all the way down to the library, basically, to show the whole table. So I compressed it as much as I could, and technically the computer is telling me that yes, there are 1,642 bars over here. I didn't count them. But I couldn't minimize the fonts to that level. This is font size number 3, and there are probably 150. So for every line of word that you see here, there should be about 10 bars of there. There was no way to capture that. So what I did, I selected a few of those journals to show you what, to show you the result of the analysis. So, for example, the one on top on Acta Tropica, you see the number of articles and the different groups are represented. Now, this is not on my computer. If I was with the mouse, I can mouse over and it's going to tell you what each of these colors represent and how many are there. But that's a good representation, going journal by journal, 1,600. How many of the keywords, how many of the peoples are represented in veterinary medicine research? You follow me so far, right? Catching my breath. The next one, which is for me, this is the most important analysis here, is to look at the keyword categories and look into the Scopus subject areas that I listed before. Looking at the keywords, the peoples, and look at the subject areas which are listed on top over there. These are directly from Scopus: agricultural and biosciences, biochemistry, environmental science, health professions, immunology. All these categories came from Scopus after I pull out everything related to veterinary sciences. So then I look at those that breakdown by the peoples, and I got this table, which I lost connectivity here. Okay, thank you. Which basically using the same graphical representation, it goes to show you in veterinary medicine, and I cannot mouse over it here, but how many articles are there? There are about, I believe it's 213 in just pure veterinary science journals, and then the breakdown by the different people's by color representation. Psychology, in veterinary science, you're going to find a lot of the behavioral, animal behavioral articles and people behavior with animals in psychology journals. Pharmacology, nursing, multidisciplinary research and journals, there's a lot there. Medicine by itself includes quite a large number of journals, and then agrobioscience, and this includes animal science, which is a different category, has the most over here. Now, see, yeah, perfect, that's what I want. If I look at just that classification of veterinary journals, there are 213 articles that deals with Hispanic and Latino populations, and that's the breakdown. You're gonna see that there are many zeros there at the end because these categories were represented in all the journals. Next steps, and that's where I was up to yesterday. Next step is to continue this cross analysis, keywords in context, like what you have here. I'm showing the keyword Latino and then how it relates to the context, to the paragraph or the abstract. That's going to help me identify whether the article is really related to what I'm looking for. If they are integrating the Latino experience, the Latino knowledge into veterinary medicine, or if the article is just listing the keyword as part of something else in the structure. If that's the case, I can discard that and then come up, fine tune, and get the right precise list of articles that I'm going to go follow up in the second part, which is the thematic analysis. Stepping back, 9,554 articles related to veterinary and agricultural science with Latinos and Hispanics. 213 of them on pure veterinary science journals. But if we're going to look at the bigger picture for context, remember that all the articles listed in Scopus about veterinary science came up with 336, right? So that's not including Hispanic or Latinos. So if I'm going to look at the 9,500, that we basically Hispanic Latinos are represented in 2.84% of Scopus journals dealing with the same topic. But if I'm going to go at the pure veterinary science journals, 213 represent 0.06. So Latinos and Hispanic in veterinary specific articles or veterinary specific journals account for 0.06% of the literature. Now, when I see this trend, my mind goes, I know what's going on here. Because of that experience that I had in that previous research, when out of 900 articles, only one was truly discussing the Latino perspective in that given area. So I'm going to assume that once I go and fine tune that list, I'm going to view a few articles that explains the Latino experience, Latino knowledge, Latino skills into veterinary science. And this number is going to come drastically down. So that's what I expect to see later on. And that's my presentation so far. Any questions? And I believe this is the Q&A session.
Yes, so we have a couple of minutes. We're running a little bit behind schedule. So if anyone on Zoom has a question, please feel free to hop into the chat. Thank you very much. This was a really wonderful presentation. Thank you both to both of our presenters. And coming up, we have Regina Montoya, who was one of the very first Mexican-American women to attend Harvard Law School. She was one of the first. She's also an award-winning broadcast journalist, and she's also a community leader, an activist, Latino advocate. So if you are interested in attending that, you can attend via Zoom, or you can join us in 165 ComC 156, and there will be boxed lunches provided, so it's just downstairs. So any questions so far? All right, well, once again, thank you so much, and we will rejoin here in about 5 minutes. Thank you.
So we go down, grab the food and go here, or?
The meeting will be in